Hi there, my name is Memo, this is my channel, Houseplantygoodness, and essentially it's a place where I like to geek out about my big passion. You might be able to see somewhere behind me, it's tropical houseplants. So you trying to decide what the best growing media might be for your specific houseplant. Stick with me and I'll dive into soil types, and I'm not going to use the word soil, I'm going to use media and it will make sense in just a bit, and which ones might work best for your plants. Again, this is based on my experience. It might be different to you, but I will give you a bit of background as to the kind of care that I would give my plants and what I have found works well and what I found doesn't work. So a bit of background in terms of what type of a plant parent I am. And that is kind of hovering plant parent. So I would probably class myself as a plant parent that has a tendency to overwater. I wish I was one of those plant parents that could do benign neglect and let plants dry out, so an underwaterer. But both of those extremes have got merits. You just need to be sure that you're getting the right type of plants. And again, you can still kind of make it work, and also that you're using the right growing media. And let's dive into what I class as growing media, and again why I use the word growing media. So growing media is any kind of material that you've got your plant in and it's rooting out into. So within the houseplant world, a lot of the times, and let's kind of go through it, you've got kind of regular houseplant potting soil, which is usually how it's sold in bags, either in plant stores or in garden centres. And a lot of the times, at least I think here in the UK, that's starting to stop now, it does have peat moss inside. And as I said, the reason why it's good that it's stopping now is because peat moss really isn't that much of a renewable kind of source globally at the moment. Yes, it can build up again after a while, but it has been over kind of utilized for many years. So there's a lot of places that are now moving away from that. I think, if I'm not mistaken, the UK, after a certain, maybe in the next couple of years, you won't be able to buy any form of soil mix, whether or not it's for houseplants or for outdoor plants, with peat moss in it. So, which is really good. The issues with peat moss a lot of the time tends to be that it's very moisture retaining. It's kind of almost like a sponge. So that can cause some trouble. A type of soil that I probably wouldn't use for houseplants, at least in my conditions here in the UK indoors, would be regular kind of soil that you would have, or topsoil that you would have outdoors. I know I've got a lot of subscribers here and followers on my Instagram that are from around kind of India and also some of the Far East as well, and sometimes they do use that type of soil. I think they also use cow manure. I don't have any experience with that. I get a lot of questions from people going, I've done this and I've done this and I've never used that material, so I don't know. I'm not saying that it's wrong, I'm just saying I don't know. I've not had any personal experience from it. If you have, and you've had some good experiences that you would love to share with people, please do drop a comment down below, and I'm sure a lot of people would really appreciate that, but I don't have any experience with that. Generally with kind of soil that you would get in the garden, it doesn't necessarily have the level of aeration, and aeration is just pockets of air that you might get within the soil for a lot of the tropical plants. I have said it before and I will say this until I'm blue in the face. We all need to remember where some of these plants are growing, which is the jungle floor in tropical environments. Sometimes their roots don't even reach down deep into the soil, and they're growing in kind of leaf debris and a lot of things that are on the jungle floor. So it's very airy. So we need to be replicating that as well, which leads me into the topic of amendments. If you're going to use something like a houseplant soil, not just that exclusively, you should be amending it. Some of it will come with it within the packet. I would always say you need to go that extra step. I'm not just being extra with this, it will help you to add in things, even if you can't add a whole bunch of other things into it. Just buy a bag of perlite. And perlite is expanded volcanic stones. It's the white thing that looks like polystyrene beads, and it will just help kind of give some of that aeration. Other alternatives to that could be things like lava rocks, pumice. All of these things will create those kind of pockets of air within the soil media. The difference with those, a lot of times they're more expensive, they are heavier, which means that they also won't float. So when you water with perlite, after a while, you'll get some of that perlite floating to the top of the pot, and it might not be so much in the soil anymore. It also doesn't add any weight to the pot. So if you want something that will have a weight to it, I'm thinking if you want to have something on a shelf that's going to hang over and you want the pot to be able to kind of not tip over because it's so light when it's dry, try thinking about stones like that in it, because it will help create that level of kind of weight essentially to it. So that's one thing. The other option, if you're not going to be using, and this is what a lot of people are using at the moment, is using something like Coco Coir, and that essentially is just coconut fibers. Yes, there's a lot of hot debate on this. I was a bit annoyed a few months back when I saw people kind of sharing all the things that are wrong with Coco Coir. Yes, there's probably a lot of things there, but if you're going to share something with everybody and say this is horrendous, give them an option of what is better at least. Just poo-pooing on something that's there and that might be the only option for people, for me, is a bit of a do really. But it is what it is, and that was my 2 cents on that topic. So Coco Coir is one of the main media that I will grow in. With the exception of me first starting off with houseplants, I've kind of moved away from houseplant soil very quickly. I didn't find that it worked with my kind of care type. So I moved over to Coco Coir. It can also be quite airy at times. It tends to dry out a bit more. It doesn't also compact like a brick, where you can sometimes get it with that peat moss in the houseplant soil. If you let it dry out for too much, it just turns into like a solid lump, and it takes a while to re-moisten it as well. Again, probably not as much of an issue for me because I am the overwatering type, and I will add an extra comment on here. This isn't just for overwaterers like me. Most of the bits that I'm going to talk about today, if you take the polar opposite of it, would work most times with underwaterers as well. So I'll give you my experiences because I can talk from experience on those topics. But if you take the polar opposite of that, that would probably apply to you more if you are an underwaterer. The other soil type or soil, the other growing media, not soil type, is something like Leca, and that is light expanded clay aggregate, I think that's what it is. I'll correct myself if it's up here, but essentially it's little clay pebbles that you can grow plants in, and this is a much more airy mix. This is when you stop treating your plant as if it's in soil. You can do with the Coco Coir the same way that if it was growing in soil, and with Leca you start doing it as semi-hydro. And semi-hydro or passive hydro or passive hydroponics or semi-hydroponics isn't a full hydroponic system. That's where the semi word comes in there, and it is things that like you can plant with its roots in Leca, or the other option which I'll talk about in a moment, and a lot of people have seen this a lot of the times on my channel, which is pon. You can grow these plants, their roots will be in this growing media, so the Leca or the pon, and there's usually a water reservoir, so they're getting their nutrients, not necessarily, because a lot of the times Leca and pon is fully inert. It doesn't have any biological elements to it that the plants can kind of pull through. Arguably, there might be some minerals the plant might be able to pull from the pon, and I might be wrong with that one. I don't think there's something that it can necessarily pull from there. That's why with a lot of times with pon, you would have fertilizer beads in it. But with Leca, I'm pretty sure there is no nutrients within that expanded clay pebbles, essentially. So you would put in the fertilizer, semi-hydroponic fertilizer, it gets convoluted here, within the actual water itself. And as I just mentioned, pon is the other option that I'm aware of, which is just a brand name. The brand itself is a product name, actually. So the brand itself is Lechuza, and the product is called pon, but it's the term that everybody's started to use to describe it now. You don't have to buy pon from Lechuza, you can create your own pon. Probably won't call it pon, you might call it something else, by just mixing those ingredients together. And there's a very large community of people that have been doing this for a while. They'll play with the size of the pebbles, all of these things, the percentages of zeolite, which is one of the things that's in it, or lava rock, or pumice, or maybe they might ignore one altogether. They might add in the slow release fertilizer pebbles, they might not. Again, as I said, this is the Leca and the pond side of things tends to be for people that have been doing this for a while and they want to play around and experiment for something that works well for them. I will give honorable mention to kind of growing media amendments, and this is probably going to be more on the houseplant soil and the Coco Coir, and that is things, obviously I mentioned perlite a moment ago, but you can do things like adding in orchid bark, the bark that you would use, orchid bark chunks that you would use for your orchids. Then you could also add things like vermiculite in it, which again, a lot of people don't know, this is also expanded rock like perlite is, but it just looks slightly different. This one tends to have more moisture retaining properties to it, so a lot of people will use this for seedlings to kind of keep some of that moisture but keep some of that aeration going. People will also tend to propagate in perlite or within vermiculite. So they are kind of both good amendments, and you can mix them into your soil. I do have a very old video now. I do need to maybe do an update on it on my Aroid soil mix, and I will link it at the top there. But putting all these different elements in, and you can kind of be your own little chemist and do different ratios to that might be more specific to plant types, basically. And obviously on top of that, you can add things like slow release fertilizer pebbles into it. You can add in things like worm compost, essentially, or worm poo. All of these things will help enrich that growing media that's more kind of soil type. The other thing as well is you could add something like activated charcoal in it, and it's something that sweetens the soil essentially with that one. But yes, enough about all the different growing media. Let's talk about specific plants. So growing media can be kind of strong for some plants and weak for other plants, and I'll kind of talk a bit more because I sound like I'm talking rubbish with that one, but let me expand a bit more on that. So I'll go off some of my experiences. A lot of my plants that I could move into pon, I have moved into pon. Have all the plants been happy in pon? No. So I'll give you an example of one that does really well and one that does not great, for me at least. And if you've got different experiences, share down below and tell us what you maybe do with that growing media if you disagree with my yeses and my nos, basically. So the big no for me for pon, and I'll start with that one because a lot of my plants are in it now, is alocasias. Most of my alocasias have never been particularly happy in pon. I'll give a little kind of tip that's coming up in a bit. They do, for a lot of people, I haven't tried this because I gave up on Leca a bit too quickly, they do apparently do quite well within Leca. Types of plants or genuses of plants, and again, I'm going to use sweeping generalizations. It's not going to apply every time, but I can talk from different plants of the same genus that I have put in pon, which do really well, is anthuriums. Anthuriums have done exceptionally well for me whenever I've put them into pon. It's that it kind of harkens back to what the plant generally would prefer. So anthuriums are an interesting one because they would like to have evenly moist growing media around their roots at all times and not dry out and not be sapping wet all the time, but they also need an awful lot of air around their roots. So pon does work quite well because essentially it's just little tiny rocks. There's always going to be air and there's always going to be moisture around it, especially if you've got it in a reservoir. So my anthuriums in a reservoir with pon have all done really well. And I don't think I have got an exception to this rule. They've all done exceptionally well. So that's the one thing I will say about this one. And the thing I will say about pon, and let's just start with pon. Obviously, I've started talking about pon. The one thing I will say about pon, and this is something you need to start considering, I started moving a lot of my plants into pon, even ones that I knew weren't going to do so well, for a couple of reasons. I found that plants tend to have slightly, and again, my experience, tend to have slightly slower growth rates. For instance, example of my huge Esmeraldensis that is behind me, that's not in pon. So they have got a slower growth rate within pon. They keep themselves a bit more compact. If you want to keep your plants at a relatively manageable, smaller size, and you don't want them to get absolutely ginormous because of space restrictions that you might have, pon might be a good one for you. The other thing that you need to start considering is that there's a transitional period with pon. I have done a video here about my experiences within pon in that transitional period. And I will say, when it comes to things like pon, you need to start thinking about, are you going to need it before you need it? Because you need a few months to transition your plants into it before you start adding a water reservoir at the bottom of it. So the one thing I will say there is, for instance, I'm growing in a conservatory. It gets blisteringly hot here in the summer. And last year and the year before, no, last year was my first summer in here. I don't think I was here for 3 summers. So yeah, the last summer I got to the point with a lot of my plants that were in great soil mixes, my Aroid soil mix, a lot of times the terracotta net pots. In the summer, sometimes I was watering 2 or 3 times nearly all of these plants. So that was unmanageable. I'm just like, I need something with a water reservoir so at least I can go for a few days without having to refill the water reservoir. And having transitioned that, it has meant that my summer was a lot easier. I will quickly follow that up and say that it's now starting to bite me in the proverbial behind a bit because the weather changed quite abruptly because autumn and spring in the UK are a myth. We tend to have summer or winter really, and it changed quite abruptly. And I went from having to refill water reservoirs every few days for some of these plants to I need to let the full pond dry out entirely, let the reservoir dry out entirely, leave it for a few days or weeks, and then water so that they don't throw a hissy fit. So that is something to bear in mind. But it's a good one if you are a plant parent that will tend to overwater. This is good because you can manage it. When this finally moved into the reservoir, this is a good one because you can kind of visually see when that might need refilling. The tricky thing there, and this is the one that always bites me, is you should really let it dry out a bit further past that point, because Lechuza, the brand that created the product that is called Pon, does also suggest this, and I don't see a lot of people talking about this. I have found what they say on their website for their own product tends to be accurate. So you need to not only, if the plant is sitting in a reservoir, let the reservoir dry out and let it stay dry for a few days, because anybody that has grown in pon or even Leca can see that even after the water reservoir is dried, it takes a while for all of that growing media to fully dry out. And ideally with pon, you want to be doing that. With Leca, and let's move on to Leca. As I mentioned earlier on, I don't have an awful lot of experience because I gave up on it a bit too quickly. The thing that I have discovered with Leca, and again, I'll harken on to the bit that I was talking about before, a lot of people say that it had great experiences with their alocasias. The other thing that I tried with it that really didn't work was moving things like calatheas over. So Leca is probably not going to be the best thing for plants that have got very, very, very fine roots and want to have a bit more kind of moisture around them. So I probably wouldn't put a fern in Leca. Some people, I am 100% sure, have probably done that and done it well. I've tried growing any form of prayer plant in Leca. That's probably what put me off, because for me, when I was trying it, my sacrificial plants at that point, because I consider them a bit more like an annual, were my calatheas and all of these things that I moved them into there. And I don't know whether or not I was giving it a fair chance, because they probably wouldn't have liked it anyway. So that's on me, and as I said, I might give it another try at some point. The other thing that I will warn, and again, this is based on what I'm seeing, with Leca, you do need to do regular flushes. So flush the water and flush whatever salt buildup is within the actual Leca pebbles themselves. So making sure that you've got the right pot for that can easily be flushed is a big key one there. You do need to, and I find it's quite beneficial to do that with pon as well, but with pon I can go for a month, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months having not flushed, yeah, my plant isn't going to be as happy, but I don't have a plant that is mush. From what I hear with Leca, it's a bit more frequent than that you need to do flushes. So potentially if you've got every single plant in your collection, you've got hundreds of plants like I do, it might not be viable to have to flush that often, basically. So that's something to bear in mind. But again, another one that could be quite good for the overwaterers, because they can see that the plant needs watering, and like Pon and like Leca, it could also work for the underwaterers because it gives you a visual cue of, oh, you know what, this is dried out. So you can kind of see that a bit more. Both of those things will work. Now let's move into the more kind of soil type media. So moving into the media that most people will probably come across first, which is that houseplant potting soil mix. This one, and it's been around for a while, theoretically could work with every plant that you can get as a houseplant. Caveats to this is you really need to start becoming aware of what your plant needs and what it's getting used to getting in nature, and amending it or buying something like Soil Ninja's pre-mixed soil mixes and all these things is going to be key, because some plants are going to need a lot of aeration, but they don't need to have constant moisture around their roots. So you probably wouldn't add vermiculite there, you would add something like perlite. So it's making sure that you've got those kind of elements correct. The other thing, and I mentioned this in the very beginning, with regular houseplant soil mixes, not mixes, but the regular houseplant soil, which does have peat moss, it will, when it dries out fully, so this might not be one for the forgetful waterer or the underwaterer, especially if you let your plants dry out for way too long, it condenses into this dense brick. And it can be quite tricky because you think you're watering it, but then it's flushing out the bottom really, really quickly. None of that water is going to the inside of those roots. So the plant will still continue to get drier and drier and drier. So there is a way around that. You can sit the whole pot with soil mix in a container with water and let it slowly kind of like absorb the water from the bottom, and it will swell up like a sponge. But I find if you've done this a few times and it started like to pull away from the sides of the inside of the pot, yeah, it's time to maybe change that soil. It's not my preferred growing media, but I do know that people have had success with this. And do I think you can? Yes, but I think you do need to make amendments to it. So adding perlite, adding vermiculite, adding things like the orchid bark, things like that. And I know different regions as well, like some people can get fern fibers and all these things, or rice husks and things like that. These are not things that are easily available for me, but I am aware that culturally in different countries, you can get different amendments for soil, which are really interesting. And actually on that point, if where you live gets things that are different than the standard vermiculite, perlite, and orchid bark, things like the fern fibers and all these things, do share it down below. I'm sure myself and everybody else would love to hear that, actually. But yeah, so that is something to bear in mind when it comes to things like the traditional soil mixes. As I said, most plants will do quite well within that, basically. Now, moving on to what I class as probably the better version of that is that Coco Coir mixed in with the amendments again. You'd still have to go through the same issues that you would have with the soil mix, but because it doesn't have the peat moss, it doesn't tend to condense quite as much. It doesn't have some of those issues. Yes, as I mentioned earlier on in my video, there are issues as well with how green coconut fiber is, because it takes a lot of air miles to get it to places where it doesn't grow naturally. Yes, it's a byproduct of the coconut industry and it does need to be used up, but a lot of the times they might be washing it in kind of saltier water, so there might be salt deposits within that coconut fiber. So there's a lot of issues that you also need to consider, but you need to see what you are comfortable with, basically, not just in terms of what your plants can grow in, but what you are comfortable with ethically. I don't think any of these growing media is inherently ethically reprehensible, but that's a personal opinion for most people, basically. So, but yes, I found that for me, and it has worked really well, and I will say it again, every single one of my last my large plants, I'm trying to think now, every single one of my large plants is pretty much in my Aroid soil mix. So, and you can be smart with your pots as well, because if you want to keep the moisture in a bit longer, you can use a plastic pot. If you want it to wick out a bit more, you can use a terracotta pot. If you want it to wick out very quickly, you would then use something like a net pot. And again, depending, like if you've got succulents or more cacti kind of things, you can do it with cocoa fiber, and you can do it with both the kind of houseplant soil. And with that one, you might not be adding perlite, but you might be adding in sand. Because again, think about where some of these plants are growing. But yeah, hopefully that makes a bit more sense. I'm now realizing as I've been going through the video, I might have not have actually specified certain genuses that do really, really well. I've said good and bad for some of them, but I'll see if I can, in editing, have put in a section on the side here which will probably go on about the yes and the no's for me in terms of each of the soil media. But yeah, this is an interesting one that I'm hoping might have quite a bit of conversation in the comments, because soil mixes tend to be very, very unique to people's own kind of preferences and the way that they might grow their plants and the type of plants that they enjoy growing. So maybe share your preferred soil mix or growing media down below. And yeah, hopefully you've enjoyed. Hopefully I shall see you here soon. And I truly, truly hope that you have a great rest of your day. Thanks. Bye.